All right, it's 4:05 Eastern Time and 1:05 Pacific. We'll start this talk nerdy presentation of the day. As some of you know, but those who are new to this, Talk Nerdy is an event that it's an initiative by Thinkingbox and Antisocial, which is also a Thinkingbox company. We cover like various like new technology, as well as creative thinking in terms of how that could really be useful in our, day-to-day operations for clients and beyond in terms of in the advertising world. Today, of course, we are talking about the importance of AR, as you may have already seen in our invites. AR can be many, many different things, and there are many creative ways to use it, as well as like how would we then make it feasible from a technical standpoint. So with all these considered, we will actually like to walk you through our thinking, our approaches, as well as actually from strategic standpoint of view, as well as technical side of things. Quick intro about ourselves. I'm the host today, Satoru Inoue, executive producer at Thinkingbox Toronto. We also have Helen, our director of strategy, and Justin, our director of creative technology. And a little quick agenda here. So this is the introduction that we're doing at the moment. We have 5 more sections in the presentation today. First, we'll touch on why AR. This is where more of the strategic thinking comes in, and on exactly how we can utilize AR to achieve your objectives creatively. And then Justin will touch on types of AR, how do you use AR, and what's next in terms of technology, followed by Q&A. So what we'll like to do is we'll probably spend about 35-40 minutes of the first chunk of the time for the presentation itself. And then I'm pretty sure a lot of you will have some questions. So please feel free to type in your questions on the chat section that you can see at the bottom of your screen. During the presentation, I'd like to ask all of you sincerely to just stay on mute. Again, just to avoid any of the awkwardness where so many people talk at the same time. But we will try to answer as many questions as possible that you may have on the chat screen when you get to the Q&A section. All right, then. So first, we'll have to just define AR before we talk about AR. This is how we are going to frame it for today. Augmented reality is the process of using technology to alter our natural world with graphics, sounds, and feedback. And I mean, some of you may disagree with this definition, so do let us know if that's the case on the chat screen. But this is how we usually frame it, and based on this, we do have our strategic thinking as well as like our creative and technical choices to achieve each objective. So without further ado, Helen, please take it away on why AR.
Thanks, Satoru. And I think there's a lot of really interesting points about augmented reality in general that I think when we're looking at this notion of why AR, I don't just think it's about why AR in this moment, although that is definitely one of the lenses with which I was thinking through why we would want to explore this more thoroughly from a creative standpoint, from a strategic standpoint for our brands and our clients, but also just, why AR in general. Because I think there is such an interesting aspect to it, right? There's sort of 4 main areas I really wanted to focus on. Was first the transformative aspect of the technology. It really allows us, in a really tactical sense, to sort of transcend limitations of storytelling and help us change worlds, help us change targets and consumers. It also allows us for deep personalization. It allows us to work with our consumer targets to really help them customize the kind of experiences that they want to have. I think another area that's really valuable in the notion of augmented reality is looking at the notion of demonstration. I think there's a lot of different ways in which we learn and take in and synthesize information. And I think that augmented reality allows us to bridge the gap between reading, hearing, but also exploring and working through problems ourselves. And then finally, actionable measurement, right? There's a number of different aspects that I also think are really important around augmented reality. For instance, I think it's an incredibly democratic way of showing big creative ideas. It allows us to, transcend the limitations of geography, for instance, right? Here in Canada, live activations, for instance, absolutely live in the major urban centers of Vancouver, in Calgary, in Montreal, and in Toronto, largely just due to population density. And it does allow us to bring ideas to larger groups of people, as well as to create things that last a little bit longer than, say, a 1 or 2 day activation. But I think the other thing it allows us to do by being linked to people's devices and being able to be accessed within their homes is really allowing us to also have actual measurement and really creating immersive digital experiences that aren't just amazing for the consumer, but also allow us to learn new things about them. So I'm just going to break each one of these out for you and give you some examples before I hand it off to Justin, who's going to take you through the more interesting technical nitty-gritties. So first, the idea of transformation. I've been thinking about augmented reality a lot because I think, well, let's be honest here, I would be remiss not to think about the impact of COVID-19 on all forms of the marketing ecosystem, including experiential. But I think ultimately there is really no true substitute for an in-person event, right? We can leverage all sorts of technology. We can leverage live streaming. We can leverage Zoom as an example. But there is something about being able to be in a space and experience things, not just from a face-to-face perspective, but around other people, that I think no matter how hard we work from a digital standpoint, I don't think we can ever really substitute that. So instead, what I've been thinking about over the past few months when we've been working with our clients for these kinds of challenges is, rather than trying to create a substitute for in-person, or as I like to call it, meet space, MEAT space interactions, how do we instead take this opportunity to create experiences that would not be possible unless it was in a digital space? How do we blow the walls off entirely, and rather than trying to create a one-to-one substitution, that we then use augmented reality or other kinds of technologies to provide wholly unique experiences that wouldn't be possible in the limitations of being in an analog world? Right. And I think a really good example of this that I've been seeing, there's many, but one in particular is the beginning of the Unreal exhibit that's been happening in London along the Thames rivers, where there are augmented reality hotspots throughout the entirety of the river and the density, like the downtown dense core, that allow individuals to use their devices to create access to custom exhibits that have been made to complement the environment. And these are interactive. They have a sense of scale and specialness and a place. And I think that what's really interesting about this is that it allows this art exhibit to really kind of transform the world that people walk by every single day, and really maybe take for granted, but also allows the artist to transform limitations that come from, for instance, construction and budget, or even just to really bring their vision to life of how people can interact with things in a way that they couldn't do if they were actually trying to create these things in a physical space. Right? This really allows them to overcome challenges like budget, time, construction, permits, and create something that's really special and really designed for the space to reach people in really unexpected ways. And I think if we start looking at the ability of augmented reality to transform our environments as less of a substitute or a limitation, and instead look at it as just a whole new reality, I think that we can really take the principles and the foundations of the technology of augmented reality and create really unique experiences for people. Personalization is also something that I think is really important in augmented reality. And I think it's also something that we really need to be considering when we're looking at all of our marketing plans, regardless of where they live along the consumer journey. We are seeing more and more personalization and the implementation of data to create really personalized experiences for consumers isn't just a cool trick. It actually really delivers on the bottom line. We're seeing larger upticks in things like direct sales, in recall, anywhere between 15 to 30% on average when we're leveraging personalization. And I think that part of that is that even if we are not always entirely aware of things like algorithms and how things are targeted and presented to us, I do believe that most consumers have at least a working understanding that they are being targeted, that they are being shown things that are intended for them. And when we go a little bit deeper and we create things that are really personalized, or give the ability to allow them to add their own layer of personalization, whether it be soundtrack, whether it be colors and skins. We're allowing people to really form their own experiences. And I think that that can only help in helping develop affinity, time within an experience, and drawing that like one-to-one brand connection. And we're seeing all sorts of really interesting applications of this outside of advertising as well. This is a essentially a competitor, if you will, Peloton, called Carbon, which is an augmented reality home gym system. It has a mirror that you can install that then adds a whole layer onto it. You can not only see yourself, but also see a trainer. You can see real-time data being fed back to you to show you where you could be working or working harder. And it comes with a set of equipment that also relays this information back to the mirror. And I think that this allows people for a really personalized experience, right? And this is no shade to the technology of Peloton, because I think we can all admit it has absolutely changed the game for the home gym experience. But in this particular case, the technology really works with the user to identify those really specific areas where they may be weaker or need to work on, creating a really personalized experience that is probably just as good as working with a one-on-one trainer. I say probably because I'm lazy, but I think what's really interesting in this is that we're really looking at this issue of how do we allow consumers to define their experience and what they want to get out of the technology, rather than us just creating something and pushing it back out to them. I think augmented reality allows us for a lot of possibility in this way. And I think that we can only benefit from it personally. Oh, demonstration. That's in, see, demonstration to me is something that I'm also really interested in, because I think that there's so many different ways in which we can intake information and learn, right? Some of us learn really well by having information relayed to us, right? Sitting in lectures or watching a documentary. Some of us learn well by reading and intaking information that way. But most people learn really well from either seeing something in front of them or actually having the opportunity to do it themselves with some guidance. And most people, the majority of people, really benefit from a combination of all of those elements, or more, two or three, for as an example. And where I'm seeing a lot of really interesting innovation in this particular world is around education, right? Augmented reality is allowing for all sorts of interesting opportunities for students to see the principles that they're reading about or having delivered to them in a lecture, then come to life in front of them, or being able to bridge the gap between, say, for instance, laboratory time, but also being able to see the transformation or the progression of things before they can actually head in and apply those skills practically in a real space. And I think where demonstration is so interesting to me is when we're looking at the future of retail. I mean, we're already seeing in cosmetics in particular, Sephora is excellent at this, as this notion of adding a layer on so we can see the demonstration of color or texture on human skin, as an example. But I think, as we're looking at what does the next year, but also the next, 5-10 years look like for retail, demonstration is a really key aspect in conversion for customers, being able to see how something comes to life and being able to touch it or experience it. And now that we've become so much more heightened in our awareness of proximity and health and all these things and how they influence us, and let's be honest here, whether or not we'll be able to interact in these spaces and go shopping in real life on a regular basis, will be in flux for a while. Right. And we have a lot of virtual retailers like Wayfair, as an example, that are great at allowing you to, for instance, use augmented reality to put a piece of furniture into a space, as an example. But I think what's really interesting is now, how do we take these principles and continue to use them to leverage higher conversion? Is it about, for instance, showing how a vacuum works by allowing you to, sprinkle virtual dirt into a space and then clean it up with your finger? I mean, that's silly. Or as we, bad creative idea. But I think that there's a real possibility for how we continue using augmented reality to bridge the gap for consumers between the experiences that they're used to having in a store and how we bring that to life in an e-commerce space. And then we get to measurement. Oh, measurement. Unfortunately, I have been working in social and digital for probably, in dog years, I'm probably about 150. But one of the things that we're always asked is, how do we demonstrate the return on investment? right? How do we demonstrate what the value of our efforts are? Not just in a dollar for dollar value, because obviously that is a thing that we always want to look at, but also what else are we gaining from our efforts beyond the dollars and how it converts into sales, right? And we're always looking at ways to measure things like preference or awareness or engagement. And as the nature of platforms are constantly in flux and how people interact with them, what does it mean to now have awareness or impressions on some platforms, and how do we measure engagement? Right, back in the old days, we used to do things like how many likes did we get, how many comments did we get, but there's so many other ways that we can measure engagement. And just because an individual doesn't necessarily interact with your brand in a one-to-one way doesn't mean that they didn't see it, that they didn't respond to it, that they didn't engage with it. And we're always looking for new ways to not only have real, tangible, meaningful measurement for our clients, but also how do we then add another layer of value to give them something that they can learn and action on in the future. And I think augmented reality is such an amazing opportunity for this, because we're not just showing people an experience, we're inviting them in. We're asking them to come and step inside something that we are creating. And when we're adding those elements of personalization or demonstration, for instance, we can start to see where people prefer one thing over another, or we can start to see where in our education aspects of the brand communications that we're trying to get across, we maybe aren't fulfilling the deal, or maybe we are, right? But ultimately, we can look to this notion of how do we add augmented reality into our overall marketing plans as a way of not only creating more valuable, transformative experiences for our consumers that are entertaining and engaging and probably also educational, but then what can we take away from that? What can we take away from this time that is spent in these spaces, and how people choose to interact with the things that we create for them to then make things smarter, better, faster, stronger going forward, that speaks to people on a continued and intimate level. Right. And so with that being said, I mean, I didn't really bring a lot of brand examples into this because Justin's going to go through some of the work that we've done. I really wanted to think about this from a really big level. And so with that being said, I've also pulled a couple of other examples that I think are really interesting about the possibilities of augmented reality. So this one in particular is an acronym. Hold on, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, because you never know. It's the Versatile Extrasensory Transducer from the laboratory of Dr. Eagleman down in the States. In other words, it's VEST. And VEST is such an interesting project, right? The notion of VEST is that we have our five senses, but that there's all sorts of data that is happening in the world around us that we just don't have the capability to take in, to synthesize and move into information, right? And so VEST was really created to add an extra layer of sensory perception on top of our five senses. It reacts to all kinds of data inputs that you want it to, whether it be weather, traffic, news, but it adds an extra layer of sensation across the abdomen and over the shoulders that really creates what Dr. Eagleman's trying to frame as a sixth sense, another way of adding a layer of perception to the world around you. And on the one hand, yes, it is absolutely a cool toy. Let's never pretend otherwise. But there's also really great possibilities for individuals who have accessibility challenges. So for instance, people with visibility or hearing limitations, right? It also allows them to augment the limitations that they have around their senses to add another layer of reactivity and responsivity in the world. And I think in the world of wearables, where we're starting to explore, Google Glass did not really quite take off, but the principles that it laid down of adding another layer to our reality to help us experience and understand the world, I think is something that is only going to continue to grow. And I think that projects like VEST are absolutely at the forefront of this. There's also, practical applications. It's not just, cool wearables and exciting art installations. One product that I'm fascinated by that has come out of the US as well is a product called Accuvein, which is designed specifically to help clinicians find veins for taking blood samples or for injecting medications. And as a person who has what apparently is referred to as shy veins, they show up, and then the minute you put a needle by them, they're like, bye, I'm out. This is such an interesting product to me. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but then again, I'm a strategist. I'm not a technologist. That's Justin's problem. But I do think there's something so interesting with this idea of having this device that allows you to scan a human and then to see where your greatest opportunity is for for finding a vein that's going to give you what you need. And studies have shown that it's absolutely helped decrease what they refer to as medical incidents by over 40%. And I think for a lot of people, blood samples and having medications injected is a really stressful thing. So having that extra layer of care and insight and really augmenting the clinician or physician's already like sort of physical acumen and their expertise, I think is a really fascinating application of augmented reality. Again, adding just another layer to make things easier for everybody. And it's so cool. It's just, I hope someone uses it on me. I think it's cool. Another application that I think is really interesting for augmented reality, and I use another art exhibit for a very specific reason, is around this idea of communicating scale and impact. Right? I think that when we're looking at video and photography as a way of communicating incidents or ideas, obviously it's fantastic, but there are limitations, right? Because we are looking at 2D representations of things that live in a space. And I think a really good example for that, something that really drove it home for me, is back in 2018 at the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario. There was a massive exhibit called Anthropocene, which was all about the impact that humans have on our planet, and really kind of trying to drive home the things that we may not know of or be invisible to us in our world, and just to show exactly how it is that we are changing the face of our planet, and not always for the better. Right. And using augmented reality throughout this exhibit really lent a sense of scale. So, for instance, there was a photograph of a Carrara marble mine out in Italy. But again, when you're looking at the size of a digger, I'm sure there's a technical term for them, in this, photograph of this mine, it certainly showed how large it was. But once I brought up my phone and I was able to see the video where it started on the truck, the thing that I knew how large it was because I'd seen it in space, and then continued to pan out far beyond the limitations of the photo, it really drove home exactly how large something like that was, how big a scar it was creating in the face of our planet. And this one in particular, there was a series of videos around the burning of ivory from elephant poachers. And that in itself is just such a horrific and dramatic image. But the AR function in this took a 3D model that had been created of these physical piles in real life at the time, and then reproduced it using your device in the gallery space. And so there's still individuals walking around it as if they couldn't see it. Well, they couldn't see it because they didn't have their phones out. It was like magic. But all of a sudden you could see the size in comparison to a real person moving in space right in front of you. And it really just drove home the scale and the impact of exactly how many elephants have to suffer. And just to show this already dramatic image brought to life in a way that really drove home for me how important it is to protect this part of our natural resources. Because I think without that sense of scale or impact, it certainly would have registered with me, but I really felt it in a way that I don't think I would have had it not been for that augmented reality layer. And then finally, this is such an interesting thing to me. I mean, again, we can even debate whether or not we consider this to be augmented reality, but under our definitions of taking a natural world or a physical world and adding a virtual or digital layer to it, I think that this counts. We've seen over the past couple of years that there's been a rise of virtual influencers, which is a concept that in itself, I feel like we could do an entire presentation on and unpack that, because I think there's so many reasons as to why this has emerged in society, but also why it's so successful. But what we've also seen is that blurring of the line between the virtual and the real is coming to life in a number of different industries. And, for the, I believe it was the spring summer collection for Balmain in Paris, the entire campaign is populated entirely by virtual models. So these are real outfits, real clothes. You can absolutely purchase them from the Balmain boutique if you are of the correct size and income, I suppose. But whenever you see it in print, none of these models are real people. They are all virtual people who have been inserted into this world, and the clothes are applied to them. And not only do I think it's very successful in the fact that I think that the virtual art has certainly avoided the uncanny valley that comes when we see digitized people. It's incredibly realistic. But I think it's also adding a really interesting layer of artistic expression to fashion, right? In which we're looking at designers who are not only creating ideal outfits, but also creating their ideal models to go with it. Whether or not we consider that to be necessarily healthy for people, that is a larger conversation. But I do think that there's something really interesting about this integration between the world of high fashion, which is so incredibly visual and tactile, and then this integration, this introduction of virtual elements to help complete the picture. And I think there's something really fascinating about that. And I'm really interested to see where we go with that next. So now that we've gone and explored all these other different realms of AR and how it's been tickling what I like to call my brain shrimp, I'm going to pass it over to Justin, who's going to take us through the different types of AR from a technical standpoint.
Amazing. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, so hi, I'm Justin. And now that Helen's kind of taken us through the why of why would we want to use AR in maybe our campaign or an execution that we're trying to accomplish. I think an important next step or progression from that is to think about where can this live and how can we achieve it. So, first I'll talk about the where. Today we're going to focus on kind of the three core pillars of what I'll call the digital AR aspect of things. And I think, it's important to stress that there are many ways to go beyond these three kind of platforms, but, for all intents and purposes of today's talk and focusing on the digital side of things, we kind of thought these are the most important ones to focus on, given the climate of the world. So, talking about the first one, native AR, we can move to the next slide too, Fair. Native AR, when we talk about that, we're essentially talking about building a mobile app and kind of what comes along with that. So, when you think about mobile apps and in a branding or a marketing perspective, it can sometimes come across as a swear word, but I think there's definitely a role for them to be played. And if they fit your criteria or the execution that you're trying to do or the audience that you're trying to speak to, there's definitely a reason for them to be here and a reason for us to talk about them. So I think, when we look at it purely from a feature set, in comparison to the other platforms, a mobile app provides kind of the widest feature set in terms of augmented reality and the capability. So, things like getting access to the device specific hardware, the new iPhones that are coming out are equipped to these fancy sensors like LiDAR and things like that, all are accessible through a native mobile app. And along with that, we're able to push the boundaries on the fidelity that we're trying to achieve. So, we're tapping into the raw power of the device. We're able to push the limits of the models and the assets we're putting in there, and we're not restrained within our file sizes. So we can kind of go above and beyond, to get that look and feel that really is, the quality that the brand is might be looking for. I think, there's obviously some considerations, and the biggest one kind of that I was mentioning before was when you're talking about a mobile app, you're talking about trying to drive users to download this app and what the reason is for that. So, I think if you have a good reason for that, then it's an easy sell. But it's always a consideration to have when you kind of going into this world is why would a user want to download this app, and why would they want to repeat visit to it? Why would they want to use it more than once? So moving on from that, we're going to talk about social AR. So social AR is probably the one that probably mostly everyone here is familiar with or is used in some way, and maybe they didn't even know it. We're talking about Instagram filters, Facebook effects, Snapchat, all those types of things. And you can kind of see in our example on our images here. This was one we did with Cheetos maybe a year or two ago, to kind of give the idea of what these can look like. And when we're talking about social AR, we're talking about like the advantages you get out of going down this route is access to the audience that those networks provide to you. So obviously, these popular social networks have millions, billions of users, and they're at our disposal to kind of tap into and gain their audience. And so going through these platforms with their social tools like Spark AR or Snapchat Lens Studio, you kind of get that as a byproduct at your disposal. And so, you know, there's just like an endless amount. If you, I mean, obviously these things can come with some ad buy that you need to do to kind of get in front of more people as the world works in our industry. But you know, I think it's a much easier thing to do because it's already there. It's living in the platform. And the other great thing about these is that there's sort of this natural and understood experience to them. You know, when you put something out on one of these platforms, there's a good chance that your users have already used something similar, or they've gone through this flow before. So you don't have to spend a lot of time kind of holding their hand, talking them through it, you know, explaining how it should work. There's this sort of like, oh yeah, I get it, this is familiar. A lot of the UI remains the same, like the camera button and, you know, switching effects and things like that. So, but there are many considerations as well. When you're talking about a social AR effect, you're talking about being restricted in terms of file size and other things, features that you're able to achieve. You know, a big one is the file size. Facebook, they restrict you to 10 megabytes, but their ideal is actually a 2 megabyte file size. And if anyone's familiar with kind of like computer lingo or file size talk, that's not a lot when it comes to packing in 3D models and functionality and everything else that goes along with it. So you have to get quite creative, trying to get that fidelity where you want it to be. But there's definitely lots of ways to go about it. And, you know, we're always happy to go beyond these talks to explain to, you know, our clients and our partners about how we can do that. I kind of already mentioned generally the lowest fidelity achievable. I mean, I think that's just a byproduct of how restrictive we have to be in terms of file sizes and things like that. But another big call out for these experiences is their stinginess and their restrictions around text and logos and anything that kind of goes in that vein. It's becoming more and more difficult to push through static text on these effects. You know, these platforms really want you to have a reason for that text to be in there and not just like blatantly selling something to the user. So, you know, it's driving us to be more creative. You know, I think it's been a bit frustrating in the past, but I think it also is an interesting problem for us to try and solve and get more creative with how we're executing these things. You can kind of see in our example, the Cheetos one as well. When we did this one, we were able to put a logo kind of front and center on the top left there of that bottom left GIF. But that wouldn't be allowed anymore. So they've now tightened up their rules and regulations. And so you could, if you look at the pillars, you can see there's some text on those. That would still be allowed because that's living within the world of it. So just things to call out and consider when you're thinking about going down this road.
Yeah, just jumping in here because we did recently launched a lot of Facebook and Instagram social AR projects since the fall because there's been a uptick in popularity. What we know is that as far as Facebook policy goes, which is getting stricter and stricter in here, you can see that Cheetos Museum logo there. They had loopholes back then that's been closed. Even that, you know, on the pedestals, you can see like the little bit of the text on the 3D environment that's technically allowed. Facebook also doesn't like it necessarily when in the review process, so they might reject you when you know, basically submit the app or the filter for approval to be shown to the audience. What we typically done, and this is something that we could have done alone, is our partner and clients, they will have some relationship with Facebook itself. So they'll have to make exceptions for certain filters to have their logo in any way. Like in terms of marketing, I know brand logos are important. So, but those are the only ways that we know currently that could have a brand logo in any way inside an AR filter. So that's something to know. But again, there are ways, clearly, including some, you know, talking with the Facebook team and whatnot as well, depending on like, you know, the criticalness of the element. So that's something to note as well. Sorry, Justin, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, thanks for that, Stu. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of like in a nutshell social AR. And the next one we'll move on to is web AR. Obviously, of all the platforms, the web is actually the oldest, but in terms of the AR world, it's kind of the newest. And it's still what I'll call work in progress, I guess, for lack of a better term, but they're kind of like working on standardizing what VR and AR mean on the web and how we can develop these experiences on the web. And it all boils down to the various different browsers kind of agreeing on a standardized approach to how it should be implemented and how developers can access the tools they need to create these things. So that being said, I mean, there's still definitely things we can do, and there are tools that have been created, what we call third-party libraries in developer terms, that we can use. You know, these things usually come with a cost, but there are things that we can leverage and use that help us get around these browser boundaries and actually create a similar experience across the different browsers. So, but when we talk about the features or like the positives in terms of web AR, I mean, obviously it's that same kind of argument. It's the adverse of a mobile app. It's simply a website. So there's that huge benefit of I can just share a URL or a link, and I can get people to go to my page and see my experience from the get-go without any downloads or anything like that. So there's that kind of huge advantage in that regard where you're able to have that low barrier for users to simply visit the site and not need to worry about any of that. Another really cool feature is the ability to embed these experiences in other web pages. So you don't have to build out a site that's exclusive to it. You can use like an iframe or something like that to put this in. You could sprinkle it down your homepage, for example, if you wanted to show something off, a piece of your technology or your tools. Or for example, like on a product page, if you're selling products, you could have this as a piece of that product page where you could maybe put the product in the user's world or give them that opportunity to. There's kind of like a lot of doors that get open when you get into that world of web, and you know, kind of seeing that these features grow more and more, especially with these third-party tools that we're able to leverage. And then we'll talk about fidelity. It's kind of like what I'll call mid-tier, and all that means is that it's still on the web. And I don't know if anyone's had experience with creating 3D assets in the web, or WebGL as we like to call it. There are certain parameters you got to work within, and it still is a little bit harder to achieve that like really high fidelity, really high polished look that you can in, say, example, a mobile app or a desktop application or things like that. But there's a lot of the work being done, and there's a lot more we can do in that world. So, and then considerations beyond just being in its infancy. Some of these tools are fairly expensive to use. So, you know, budget is always a consideration when going that route. And then working within web, if anyone here is familiar with it, comes with the headache of browser specific limitations or cross browser support. And, you know, things like video autoplay come to mind with like being able to have the sound on versus, you know, sound off on iOS and things like that. So, you know, all considerations that we would definitely be flagging to you as clients or partners before we kind of get into any projects. So yeah, quickly I'll move into the how. So not really a linear progression, I guess, from the where to the how. I think this is something you should think about kind of as you're thinking of the where, but you know, for the purposes of our presentation, when we talk about the how, we're kind of talking about three core aspects of it as well. If we move to the next slide. The three kind of ones that we want to focus on that are kind of the mainstays or the similar features that are across all the platforms that we've talked about so far are target tracking, body or gesture recognition, and then or surface and room detection. So you know, first off, moving into target tracking. If you're familiar with AR, you've probably seen or experienced something like this. It's the ability to give an AR experience an image that it can recognize, and that can be for example, a product label. It could be a brand logo. And actually, the more unique the image, the better this works. So the more variety that you have in that image data is the better it'll actually work for you. You don't want something that's too symmetrical or too similar across the board, that you'll have more troubles getting your image to be picked up. But this feature is like a standard reliable feature. It's one that's supported across all 3 platforms that I kind of talked about previously. It's really good for, like I said, brand or campaign logos and kind of garnering recognition around them, because it's like your kind of key gateway to this sort of like deeper experience when we're talking about AR. And it's a really useful mechanism for that. So it works well, and having that kind of image to track with the phone actually kind of really grounds the experience for the user to kind of like walk around and interact and see things happen. Caveats that are kind of notable to call out for this are lighting and materials. If things are too shiny or glossy, you're going to maybe have users have a hard time picking up on it, or if there's a big glare across your image, that's going to affect the experience for the user. I'll move into the next one, which is kind of facial tracking, body and gesture detection. When we talk about this, it's kind of like that selfie experience, for lack of a better term. And this is probably the one that most people would equate to like a social platform, like Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat, and probably the one that most people are familiar with. Generally used on that front-facing or selfie experience. And these features are typically like facial features, for example, the mouth and it being open or smiling or making a kissing face or things of that nature. The eyes, where the eyes are looking, are they open, are they closed? Eyebrows, are they lifted? And the head, the rotation or the position of it. And so, that's kind of like the most basic features that we kind of get out of the box with most platforms. You can see in our example of our kind of holiday, what we called AR cards that we handed out, our turkey one, when you lifted your eyebrows, the glasses would kind of move. When you smiled, I think the wings would go out. And same thing with the Rudolph filter, you smile and the nose would turn red. So, just kind of fun examples of how you can maybe use those mechanisms to bring your effects to life. And then there's more advanced features that some platforms are kind of coming out with. And then we're talking about like hand or limbs and picking up on those gestures. And for the most part, that equates to like, where are the hands moving? Where are they located? Are they open? Are they closed? And then for the body, it's where's the body and can we take the background out of the body or out of the picture and replace it with something else to kind of put our user in another world. Considerations for these is that it's kind of up in the air a little bit in terms of on each platform, and I won't go into too many of those details in the essence of time today, but would definitely be more than happy to chat with anyone about them in future calls. But it's just like you have to know that maybe one thing you can do on Facebook, for example, you might not be able to do on Instagram, or one thing you can do on a native app and you might not be able to do on the web. So just things to call out there. And then moving into surface and room detection. It's the same idea, except it's the opposite of looking at the user. You're kind of looking away from the user, and generally lives in what we call the rear-facing camera. And this is great for experiences or concepts that you kind of want to understand the world around the user and kind of augment it in that way. I think Pokemon Go was kind of the very first example of doing this like in a very mainstream way. And then, there's been so many others beyond that. I think somebody mentioned in the comments already about the IKEA experience. That's definitely a great example of doing this. And I think, those kind of product configurators come to mind right away, vehicles or furniture, to kind of let users really see and know how things might look in their environment. I think that's a great use case we've seen of how these things are being achieved already. And when we get into the more advanced kind of features of this conversation, we're talking about like mostly mobile apps, but the web is kind of playing catch up, and they're getting there, and they're detecting a user's floor or their tabletop. They're able to actually understand the walls in the user's house, or even the ceiling beyond that, and actually when we get into LiDAR, the LiDAR conversation, we're talking about objects in the room and where they are in relation to each other and all that good stuff. And it kind of gets deeper and deeper as we go into it. And it's a similar consideration here for room and surface, is that you're kind of like looking at that disparity among the platforms. We're not all platforms are made equal, unfortunately. So we kind of get that conversation of, can we do this here versus over there? And so when you really want to support the wide gamut of platforms in a campaign, you have to consider that they might not work the same way across the board. And lastly, what's next? So I'll just quickly go into like things we're noticing. By no means are we prophets and know what exactly the future will hold, but these are some things that we've kind of, from our research, are seeing, and then also just trends that are already emerging. And the first one is LiDAR, which we've kind of mentioned already. It's actually not a new technology. It's been around for a long time, but it's kind of resurfacing because we're seeing technology companies and products think about how they can use it in different ways. And I think the biggest ones are obviously the new iPhones, and then autonomous vehicles, for example, with Teslas, and being able to know where they are in relation to the road and self-driving and all that fancy stuff that's happening in that world. And then beyond that, wearables have been around for a while and will continue to be around. And both of these things are probably more applicable in an out-of-home or an installation setting, but I think they're important to know that there are things happening and developments happening in that regard. Talking about wearables, I mean, the HoloLens is like the very first and foremost thing that comes to mind for probably most people. Microsoft made that a fairly popular tool, and it's becoming more of a workplace tool, or it's seeing a lot in the trades. But it still has its uses in an out-of-home setting. And moving beyond that, we're thinking about like what Helen already talked about with the vest and haptic feedback, and not just using the visual sensory to augment a user's experience, but using some of the other senses like haptic feedback and touch and feel, whether it's wearing vests or wristbands or watches or headbands. There's definitely different ways to go about it. And then right down into audio, there's a lot of research being done. I know Facebook is in particular into how we can really make audio work to our advantage in an augmented or a virtual reality setting. And most of that is because there's this kind of feeling of disconnect these days still with when you're in those experiences. We can't completely drown out the environment around the user. So they're trying to figure out ways to kind of really immerse you into that. And I think it's exciting stuff. So that sums up kind of what's next, and I'll let Satoru take it back.
Oh, thank you, Helen and Justin. So now I'm pretty sure there will be some questions that you may have. So feel free to use that chat screen. I think some people have been already chatting there with some questions, but we'll love to hear your thoughts or questions. And again, all of us will try to answer as much as possible. So please go ahead and type away. I think there was a question from Mary earlier that I think has been answered by some of our crew actually, but I can actually expand a little more on it too, Mary. So yeah, typically, even if it's a brand, instead of going for their own like proprietary system, since those are like expensive endeavors, like certain like companies like that provides AR services, like for example Facebook or Eighth Wall for Web, those are multi-million-dollar endeavors. So they provide those platforms, and what we will typically do when we like to create an experience for marketing purposes. Depending on the objective, we'll pick which platform to go for. So that's how we will usually cater to the platform, instead of like, try to create the tool from scratch on our own, because, that usually wouldn't fit within like any given budget or timeline that marketing campaigns may have. When it comes down to like a larger activation, like, that involves physical components, that could be a different story. We'll still need to create an application that digitally integrates with the physical component of the experience, but that will still most likely rely on existing technologies that these larger companies will create and provide. So that's how we would approach most AR projects. And I see some questions coming in. Where do you see the most additive properties around AR when it comes to customer usage? I mean, I think he means addictive or additive. No, sorry, additive properties around AR when it comes to customer usage. I think that'd be a good question for Helen and potentially for Justin as well. But do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. So just to clarify, Chris, you can just say in the chat yes or no. If I'm to understand you correctly, what you mean is when I was talking about the different layers of the different kinds of experiences that augmented reality can provide for consumers, are you talking about where do I see like the most benefit, or where do I see that being used most often? I'm just curious. I want to make sure.
Can I just talk? It's so much easier to talk than type, because
Sure.
obviously I don't know how to spell. So I think it's both, honestly, Helen. It's really, so like I have a team that's super hungry to get into AR, and we work with a lot of clients that I think have a lot of potential for it. And really what the question often comes is like, where's the most impactful usage of it today? And then which ones do you really see kind of riding the wave where it's not a fad or a trend, but actually utilizes a tool? Like those seem to be a lot of the conversations of like, this looks cool for a campaign, but we're talking about investing millions of dollars or something into this, and I don't want it to fail in 6 months.
No, absolutely. So I think to answer the second part of that question first, if you will, is like, I think that the industries in which we're seeing it becoming the most prevalent and probably the most useful for people are around that demonstrative aspect of it, right? That I was referring to. It's sort of the third point that I was thinking about. And that, we're really seeing this being leveraged for things like cosmetics as an example. It's a really good example just to see how a color might look on your face in a world where you can't sample something. Or for instance, again, applications like IKEA or Wayfair, areas where we're seeing things like furniture or elements that have to exist in space where people may have measurements, but they may not actually have a really good idea of what that actually means in a one-to-one impact, right? Like I might know that this is 3 feet, but what does that actually mean in the context of my space? I know that there's also an emergence of virtual styling for houses for sale or apartments as an example, right? In a world where it's not only difficult to get items in and out to style a house that's going up for sale, but also sometimes very cost prohibitive. Virtual styling and using augmented reality, so taking photographs of the space and laying furniture over top as an example, has become really popular. In fact, the apartment I live in right now, I thought that they styled it really well. It turns out they'd used an app for that. So I think that that's really those areas in which it's becoming the most prevalent. And if I was to say, where do I think, it's becoming the most commonplace from a long-term perspective, I would say yes, anywhere where there's a demonstration aspect, especially when an individual can't, say, like for Wayfair, walk into a showroom as an example, to see what that chair would look like in their space. I think that's really where it's become the most commercially viable and the most sort of long-term in that aspect. But I think there's a lot more possibility than that, right? I think that there is, so as an example, if you want to get a little bit romantic about it, the world of high fashion and the world of perfume and cosmetics in general has always been a world that's very focused on the notion of a brand story or an immersive brand experience. And I think that augmented reality has a really great possibility in that world to really allow consumers to put themselves into the reality of the brand and to make themselves part of the story. I think there's something really interesting in that. But when we're also looking at this idea of like, how can we add something to the consumer's life? I think that if we're looking at sort of really commonplace technology right now. Like Justin was saying, one of the most common applications of augmented reality as we know it is in the social space, through the uses of filters. And I think that there is, anytime that we can take an experience and turn it back onto the consumer, anytime that we can make them the hero or give them the opportunity to play around with how they perceive themselves or the space in which they perceive themselves in, I think we're always going to see great return on value. And if we can always create like a one-to-one experience, so for instance, the brazen labels that Justin provided, it's a great opportunity for people in the store to then get a brand story or to learn more about a product, as an example. But I think that, yes, whenever we can make consumers heroes and allow them to become the heroes of their own stories, or to add another layer onto their own experience and the way that they perceive the world, we're always going to see sort of the greatest benefit. I hope that answered your question directly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the meantime, we've been also answering some questions on the chat screen itself. Let me see. I'm hoping I haven't missed anything. There's a question from Eric. What are the lifespans of AR projects? That is incredibly dependent on, of course, the platform of choice and how long the project itself is intended to last for. So if you
money. Don't forget money. Like
right.
a paid filter on Instagram lasts as long as your budget does.
Exactly. Exactly. So if it's heavily reliant on just, for example, your marketing budget, just like basically have a boost on like the feed only, it could be just as long as that campaign lasts. However, for example, Figure, one of our examples that Justin was touching on, that's meant to be evergreen. So long as there would be some periodical updates that are catered to their latest actual products, they can keep on updating AR component of the entire experience as well, so that people again have a reason to come back to on a regular basis, or at least quite frequently. So that's more or less evergreen. It's meant to be a product on its own. So using AR, what I would say is, like, again, there's no clear definition of how long an AR project or property will last. It's just a matter of what the objective is for that specific experience that happened to be AR. That's how I would frame it. But if you have more specific questions in terms of like, how long does it usually last on average on Facebook and whatnot, we can try to answer the question to the best of our knowledge. And more things are flowing. I'm just following up because there's a lot of going through. What? Okay, I do see one from Daniela, but is that being answered by you, Justin, right now?
Yeah, I just was quickly trying to touch because I know time is of the essence for people here maybe. But yeah, to answer your question, 3D tools, I mean, you don't have to use 3D assets by any means, but if you are looking to that, then probably a necessity to have something like Maya or 3ds Max to create those assets. Though some of these platforms do let you create assets within them, although they're generally mostly just the primitive assets. And then as David also mentioned, for when you move into actual development, Unity can be a tool. Obviously, Spark AR you're forced to use that when you're talking about Facebook or Instagram, and then same thing with Snapchat. You're talking about using what they have as their Lens Studios is the name of the tool. So
yeah, those social platforms like Spark AR that Facebook uses and Instagram as well, you will still need some form of like 3D assets to achieve those. However, if it's literally just a face filter and we've made those, Facebook does come with a certain like geomap already, and what you will need is like just a 2D asset like Photoshop zombie face, for example, that you can just put onto the geomap, and then the Facebook platform itself will basically render it out so that it fits your own face. So that will create the illusion of 3D because the real world is 3-dimensional, yet what we only created in terms of assets is flat Photoshop. So that would be the only thing that I would say that wouldn't require anything that's 3D if you want to achieve anything AR.
Yeah. And I'll quickly answer Christian's question here too. It's a little tricky to do like cross-platform experiences, and I guess that would be mostly if you're trying to include the social AR platforms, because they are quite locked down in regards to what you can do, especially when you're thinking about going out to the network or things like that. If you were doing, if you're doing a web and a mobile app, you would probably have a lot more leeway there because you're not within the confines of your experience having to live within one of these other social apps. So there's definitely considerations to be done. I think in terms of the interest, I mean, maybe Helen would be more suited to answer that. I think there's definitely an interest. It all kind of boils down to what we always go back to with our clients or our partners, is that what is the kind of the reason for wanting to explore that, and does it make sense within the brand or the campaign? So
yeah, I think just to touch on what Justin's saying, I think as far as best practices go or insights around that, I think this is still a thing that we're not really exploring in any real depth this time. And I think it's partly just, budgets are always a constraint, but also objectives are a constraint. But I think as we start moving towards a, oh gosh, I mean, I hate to make it, but let's be real here. It's formed our whole life for the past year at least. As we move towards a post-COVID world and we start sort of working in spaces where we see a lot of that crossover, and there's going to be that sort of crossover between social augmented reality installation pieces, things that are accessed from third parties. What I would probably say is ultimately, and this sounds like such a cop-out, I first, yes, to Justin's credit, I want to know what your objectives are and want to know what you're trying to figure out. Is it awareness? Is it impressions? Is it extended engagement? And could I, for instance, do I need to use multiple platforms rather than just one, right, to achieve your objectives? But I would also say that when it comes to how to attack those, to me, that it always comes down to the principles of what would we do even if we weren't leveraging technology like augmented reality. So we'd want to look, for instance, for consistency, that things feel the same, that they sound the same, that there is a consistent narrative that goes through everything, right? That we are meeting the consumer target as we're trying, the consumer target we specifically want to speak to, in the space where they feel most comfortable, and we're asking them to do the things that come naturally to them, right? When we're trying to force people into experiences or realities that just don't really work with how they engage with technology, we're asking something of people that they're not going to deliver on ultimately, and we don't want them abandoning the experiences. And then, finally, I think what's interesting to always consider from a best practices standpoint as well is, what is the result of this integration, right? If we are not looking towards creating a whole narrative or a whole experience, like I think there's something really interesting about having individuals on web and on social to create something larger in an augmented reality space. Like I'm like right off the bat, I'm like, well, that's complicated and fun. Can never let me go too far down those rabbit holes. But then I think it's also important that it's like, if we are not working towards some kind of larger narrative in the consumer journey, then it's probably most efficient and effective to really just focus on one platform, one experience, one idea, right? If we're going to do multiple different formats at the same time, we should always ask ourselves, what's the end result? And how will these all work together to deliver against our client objectives? So a very long way to get to a very short end of the answer. Sorry.
All right. Thank you, Helen. I'm hoping that we were able to answer most
of
your questions, but just being like conscious of time, we did go over. So we'll like to wrap. However, please always feel free to email us with any questions. You know where to find us. It's in the invite. It's on the slide as well. And those who might want to rewatch this, we typically will upload it to YouTube or Vimeo as well. If you like to see it again. So usually that notification will go out within a few business days. So you can always come watch this. Or again, if you actually have any more specific questions that you like answered or projects, then you know where to find us. So thank you so much for coming again, for your time as well. And everyone stay safe, and we'll see you at the next Talk Nerdy presentation. Have a great day.